Welcome everyone to Track E. This is the international track. I'm Carl Gerber, Chief Data Officer for Deloitte US, and I'll be your track producer for the day. MIT's CDOIQ Symposium continues to expand our global reach. We have an excellent lineup of sessions that bring a world view. This is session 6E, How to Overcome Data Silos for Holistic Data Governance. Organizational structures and data silos make it challenging to establish a common understanding and consistent usage of data. Technology can help overcome these challenges to automate data documentation and implement data governance controls across an organization. In this session, Jennifer Curtis, Chief Data Officer at Freddie Mac, will share her experience successfully implementing data governance programs in various operating and organizational models. She will outline the internal and external challenges that many organizations face today, such as new regulations in privacy and new technology solutions in the cloud, and provide solid solutions for building and sustaining a holistic data governance program. So a few housekeeping items for our session. The session is being recorded, and replays and session materials for all of the symposium sessions will be made available to attendees after this symposium. We do have a Q&A session, so please submit your questions in the Whova app under the Q&A tab, and be sure to vote up those questions that you would like to see answered. And then next, I will be introducing Peggy Tsai, VP of Data Solutions at Big ID. Peggy is currently Vice President of Data Solutions at Big ID. Big ID is an advanced AI data discovery platform that helps enterprises identify and protect their customer and entity information on structured and unstructured sources. Big ID is built entirely on APIs, which are used to create apps for use cases related to ensuring data privacy, compliance, reducing data security breaches, and improving data governance. Peggy has over 18 years of practitioner experience in data management, stewardship, and governance in financial services industry. Prior to joining Big ID, she was Vice President of Data and Analytics at Morgan Stanley, where she helped run the data governance program across the wealth management division. She held various positions at Morgan Stanley, where she supported the data science teams on analytical data governance and led a project team to document data lineage and business definitions across the enterprise systems in order to comply with Basel regulations. Peggy was also Data Innovation Lead in the Enterprise Data Management Group at AIG. She was responsible for implementing enterprise data management practices to support anti-money laundering, Solvency II, and GDPR in the Latin American region and the commercial lines of business. Peggy also worked at Standard & Poor's Global Ratings, where she held various positions in enterprise data group and technology in order to drive the value of data between the business and IT. Peggy, before you begin, I also want to remind the crowd that there is a polling question. And so if you would, go to the polling tab and answer that question, and then we'll be getting to it here shortly in the presentation. Peggy, over to you.
Thank you, Carl. I'm so happy that you're here today to introduce today's session. Welcome, everyone. I hope everyone is enjoying their first day of the 2021 MIT Symposium. Whether this is your first symposium or your 15th symposium, I'm sure we all appreciate the premier data event that Dr. Wang has really put together for the CDO community. And I, for one, am looking forward to speaking on campus next year at the MIT campus. So hello, everyone, welcome. So the topic for today's session is how to overcome data silos for holistic data governance. Companies are burdened with physical data silos, whether it's transactional data that's stored separately from their operational data. The result is that it's challenging to identify real database insights to be used for automated data decisioning. So my name is Peggy Tsai, VP of Data Solutions at Big ID. And as Carl said, I have, like many of you, worked in financial services companies for many years and built out mature data governance programs. I'm pleased to have with me today on the stage Jennifer Curtis, Enterprise Chief Data Officer at Freddie Mac. who will talk about the different operating models and the factors that weigh in to make it successful at different types of companies. Jennifer, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with me today. And would you mind introducing yourself to the audience?
Of course not. Thank you, Peggy. I appreciate the invitation to talk about this with you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Jennifer Curtis. I'm the Enterprise Chief Data Officer at Freddie Mac. Prior to joining Freddie Mac just 7 months ago, I spent the prior 15 years working in data programs at American Express, Citibank, and Moody's Analytics across varying different roles in those companies. So Peggy, why don't we get started on slide 3? And as I was reviewing the agenda, I thought, wow, all this focus on AI and innovation, and here we are talking about something that we've been talking about for years already. Is this still relevant to this group of CDOs? And of course, my answer was eventually yes. As I thought about it, that this topic is as relevant as it was 15 years ago, because without creating the right foundation, progress is incredibly hard to make. And if you can't quickly figure out how your company works and organize your program around those company dynamics, you'll struggle to achieve what you need to achieve out of your program. But this topic might be even more important now. Where we used to focus on reporting and controls, we're now moving towards digital transformation, improving our customer experience, and finding new and interesting insights in our data. This makes it even more critical to knock down our organizational boundaries as well as our data boundaries. So if we go to the next slide, silos have always been a challenge for companies, but now as the amount of data increases and more types of data become available, it's becoming even more challenging to identify, understand, and stitch together data to create meaningful insights. Over 10 years ago, I was shocked to learn that my bank didn't see me as a single entity. One department knew about my loan, another about my deposit, a third about my investment account. You fast forward 10 years and people are linking my account information with things like my social media content, my device location, and I'm sure tons of things that I haven't even thought about yet. So it's more critical than ever to ensure that you create an organizational structure that reduces your silos and connects people and data. Peggy, why don't you start talking about the different types of organizational models we've seen and tried before?
Sure, and actually, is really relevant. I just listened to Randy Bean's earlier session, and he was actually asking about chief data officers, the progression of the operating model. So here are 3 types of common operating models that I've seen. I'm sure many of the audience can weigh in the chat box, things that they've seen as well. So a centralized model, really converges under a chief data officer or a leader who's working to standardize, the uniform data language that's across the organization, whether that's through enterprise tools or reporting. And that's where data warehouses and data lakes, that's a paradigm of what people think about when it comes to centralized organizational structures. And the second one in the middle is decentralized model. And I've seen this again in some of the banks. They allow for different business units to continue their own data processing and really avoids the proliferation of data silos. But what this lacks is a cohesive enterprise data strategy to really propel and move the organization forward. And this last one, my favorite one, distributed model. And I think, Jennifer, you and I think we know this better as federated model. So I'd love to have you talk about this a little bit more, and which of these do you see as most effective or most common in your experience?
Peggy, I come from large financial institutions, and if you had asked me 7 months ago the same question, I would have said distributed every time, 100% across the board. I'm operating in kind of a smaller organization now that's a little bit less complex, and never in my life have I thought we should centralize something more than I do in this organization. So I think distributed works best across most of the organizations that I have been a part of, and I think it's good to keep data close to the business and the operations it supports. So all in all, I'm a fan of the federated or distributed model. How about you?
Well, for me, when I've worked at S&P Ratings before, and it was a bit more of a centralized model where the data team really was had together in its own place all the data tools and the reporting systems. And I've also seen hybrids of that's not so clear cut. So it's be interesting to see and talk more about this later on in our talk today. So in the beginning of the presentation, Carl mentioned that there's a poll. It's been up all day on Whova. So really love to see some of the results of that poll, Carl. We've asked a question, where does a chief data officer sit in an organization?
Yes, Peggy, and you have a really good response. Over 116 people have responded.
Wow.
And the number one reporting location would be to the CIO at 41%, followed closely by the chief executive officer at 33%. So you're looking at approximately 3/4 of the respondents are picking one of those two. Then the next highest one would be the chief operating officer at 12%, followed by the CTO at 10%, and then only 3% for the CRO. So that's the results of your poll.
Thanks so much, Carl. And Jennifer, in your career, you probably reported to or worked with people with these titles. What are your thoughts on the benefits of reporting to each type of these personas?
Yeah, well, first I'll say I have reported to every single one of these with the exception of the CEO. So I was incredibly jealous to hear the percentage of people who are reporting through that reporting line, because I think that is the most effective kind of, and a goal for a chief data officer to have that reporting line. I have found in my past, there's a progression, and Peggy, you were just talking about this progression in one of my roles where I started with the CFO when we were doing our Basel and CCAR work. It moved to the CRO when we expanded to our broader risk management pillar, and then ended up with the CIO and chief digital officer eventually as we started to focus more on our digital transformation. Right now, I report to the CTO, which was one of my, the place I wanted to land least. Because I felt it removed me from the business problem, but that's something that my CTO and I are actually working through really nicely together. So I think as long as your company has the right vision, who you report to can work out no matter how you give it a shot.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about physical data silos, and I know that we all can say that physical data silos can never be avoided or completely eliminated in any company. But let's talk about how architecture and technology can help overcome the limitations of physically distributed data sets and can really support on-demand data discovery and analysis of data. So let's start to unpack this a bit more by really exploring the operating models of data governance. So I'll turn this over to you, Jen.
That sounds great. And before I get started on organizational structure, I just wanted to talk about some of the key outcomes that I'm typically trying to achieve in my data program. So this starts with understanding the business processes and how we derive value for our customers and our shareholders, and then looking at the source systems that support those processes and how we can bind them as tightly as possible to the operations that they are supporting. I then start to look at our consolidated data platforms or mechanisms that we use to bring data together and make it more consumable for our different types of users, whether it's a data scientist, a business analyst, or someone who has no experience with data whatsoever. I think about our digital platforms so that we can create a consistent digital experience across our many different digital channels. And then finally, the data governance layer where we consolidate and orchestrate our data about our data, our systems, data quality, sharing agreements, and security. So I start by trying to lay out the atmosphere that I am in and thinking through how we can best organize these areas based on how our organization is structured. So with that in mind, there are a few things I look about the organization as a whole when I'm determining the right operating model to try. The first is the business line complexity. So how many lines of business do we have? Do we have 1, 7, something in between? And where do the support functions like finance and servicing sit? Are they physically in the business or are they at the enterprise level? The second thing I think about is product complexity. So do we have one product or many products? And even with the smaller number of products, how much complexity do we allow into those products? So the third one is cross-business customers. And this is honestly my favorite one because it gives you the easiest business case to sell your business on. If we go back to my bank example earlier, it didn't feel good when I got pushed an offer for a high yield savings account that originated from my investment account when I held a normal deposit account with the same bank at a much lower rate. And it actually made me take my business elsewhere. Any company that has the same customer in different lines of business must figure out how to create that view of the customer. It just won't be able to compete. The fourth thing I look about is the legacy data landscape. So how complex and old is our current data architecture? Were acquisitions over time made where technology wasn't properly integrated? Maybe we've allowed a lot of applications to be built around very specific outcomes where we're finding lots of duplication in our data. And do we have master data sets? I threw that one in there because I'm still searching for one, but I would love one day to join a company that has some good master data sets in place already. So the fifth thing I look about is this role supposed to be offensive or defensive? Either way, my goal is about making data easier to find, use, and control consistently and responsibly across our processes. But the organization's perception of my role plays a big part in how I organize and who I focus on. And then finally, data culture. So are we data-driven or are we still seeing data as a means to an end? So let's go to the first example. So the first example is a large organization focusing heavily on risk management in a very complex data environment. People were focused on data innovation in pockets, but most viewed data as a means to an end rather than something that could derive value for the organization. There were some cross-business customers, but the complexity of the organization only allowed for some connecting of customer information. So for example, we could start to connect some consumer information and some commercial information, but couldn't connect across the two and couldn't get whole pictures of our customer. In this case, we chose a distributed model because the data problem was just too big to be overly strategic about fixing. This was straight blocking and tackling to understand how we managed our data risk. The only information we could really consolidate was in our data governance layer, so we drove our standards through that. This at least allowed for a consistent view of data and data risk across the organization. And even just doing that was really, really hard. Right, so if we go to the next example, this was another large organization. This organization was data-driven, focusing on data management, but with good practices, good data practices throughout the organization. The company was highly focused on digital transformation, but the origination of data governance at the firm was for the purpose of defensive activities only. So it was seen as two separate activities. You're either doing the defensive or you were doing the offensive. Here we were able to create some common solutions for the data governance layer, the consolidated data platform and the digital data platform, but we had to do it in kind of a stealth way. Nobody wanted to let data governance slow down our digital transformation. So here we built data governance practices into the consolidated data platforms and required businesses to build on that platform. And that was a requirement that came from the very top of the house, not from anybody within the organization. At the beginning, people complained about being slowed down, but over time, governing data just became a part of our everyday data practice, and people didn't realize they were doing it. All right, so slide 12 is a small organization, not a lot of data, but because of that, it makes data governance and management much harder than it needs to be. This one I'm still trying to figure out, so I guess you can figure who I'm talking about. But always working at larger firms, as I said before, I've never recommended a centralized model. This is the closest I've come. There isn't a lot of data, one product, two variations. The focus is defensive, but all of the business lines, and there are 6, are focused individually on their offensive activities and solving for those offensive needs on their own and individually. But the culture has always been to operate each individual business line as its own business, and there's no customers that cross business lines. My gut is this will be a distributed model where we centralize governance and maybe part of our consolidated platforms, but I still have a lot of convincing to do even to achieve that outcome. So given all that complexity, Peggy, you want to talk a little bit about how data discovery can help break down our data silos once we've started to figure out our organizational silos?
Yes, thank you, Jen. And I think you really laid out the varying level of complexities in different organizations when it comes to like the business line, the product line, and legacy data landscape. And that's really helped companies decide what type of model they're following. But the underlying consistency, that governance layer, right, that's common thread that's really going to help connect all these data silos together is data discovery. And as part of my role at Big ID, I talk to a lot of chief data officers, and they understand that there's very little possible way that they're going to physically copy and move all their data into a centralized warehouse. Like one single warehouse is not going to fit all their needs. So they also cannot manually maintain a data catalog that's really going to be up to date with all their data assets. So they need to look to data discovery to help with identifying, classifying, or labeling all their data for all their data sources and all their data types. So whether it's emails or things in their SharePoint or relational databases, it's a really powerful way to ensure that they have complete data coverage. And as a former data steward myself, I used to manually link business terms or logical concepts to physical tables or IT assets, but that's no longer needed with data discovery. CDOs can really leverage AI machine learning to help maintain their automated data catalog and to help continuously monitor and govern through policies their data across their entire enterprise. So Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you to talk about some of the benefits and also concerns that really need to be driven through this digital transformation.
Yeah, and Peggy, you just mentioned your catalog and finding your data and organizing your data and classifying your data. And that's been a big part of my role to date in my new organization. So it said my role currently is a focus on data risk management, but even in creating that catalog and making data discovery a real thing for people that they can kind of see and feel how it works, we've started to prioritize the areas we will work on from a data discovery perspective, as well as just focusing on priority areas. And that's always in my roles been data risk management. So data management across our most critical processes and decisions that we make. For privacy, understanding precisely where our consumer sensitive data sits, whose we have and how we manage it and how it flows throughout the organization. From a security perspective, something new to me in my new role is unstructured data is a top focus. So using some of the newer technology we have available to us to try to reduce the amount of physical work we have to put into identifying sensitive unstructured data and making sure that we're properly securing it. And the privacy and security isn't just internally, we're also focusing on the data that we're sharing with external parties, understanding what data is shared from a strategic and a risk perspective, but also who's and when and why and how it's used. So I always start with risk management, and from a data discovery perspective, have been able to move things much faster because we can now use tools that help us automate this process. Now, that being said, on the next slide, my goal is never risk management. My end goal is always making data easier for people to find and use. So all of this leveraging of technology to catalog our data is truly making the possibilities real for people, that we can do this broader than just our sensitive data and our risk management practices, but we can take this technology and start to leverage it to help us with our reporting, our modeling, and our analytics, and truly unwinding the complex, unnecessarily complex legacy that we've created for ourselves and some of our companies. And I know I'm talking about it as if everything works perfectly, and I think we all know there are challenges, but even over the past couple years, the advances my programs have been able to make by leveraging some of these technologies has been really meaningful, and it's also helped me sell my program much faster to people. So Peggy, now that we've kind of started talking about data discovery, why don't you take them through the rest of the materials?
Sure, Jen. And I love how you balance the defensive, right, which is the risk and compliance, with the offensive, sure, which is the analytics side. And certainly, like, what are the outcomes really of a really successful operating model for an organization? And not only is it about standardizing, the data and reducing the time to conduct all this data and insights, but ultimately, I believe it's, trusting the data. That's whether it's created and collected within an organization, no matter how we use it, I think everyone needs to build that trust. And I've heard from many of my customers, there are two major obstacles they have in improving their data landscape. One, it's lack of data transparency to the availability of their data. And secondly, it's a limited availability of data experts in their organization. So the lack of transparency, that leads to more data silos, because you have data scientists, business users downloading their own personal copies of the data, and they're really exacerbating the problem. And companies we know today are facing a talent pipeline shortage. Now that's where data discovery can help solve the problem for companies, thus allowing them to accelerate in their digital transformation journey. Data discovery is the connected foundation between and across data and organizational silos to help unlock these capabilities for privacy, security, governance, cloud migration, and much more. So here we have a methodology that I've seen resonate not only with chief data officers, but with data leaders across an organization. Now, data journey starts with defining the assets. So regardless of where the data is physically located in your organization, you're going to need to identify the categories and put it into the right risk configuration. Now, data discovery helps support the identification and collection of the metadata. So the metadata that you need, like technical, operational, business metadata, it needs to belong into a single catalog for your business users to review and to get insights on. Next, on insights, and this is where AI machine learning can really provide further automated discovery across your landscape, because it automatically can identify duplicates or similarities in your data and do things like data profiling that normally your data quality team would have to deploy. And lastly, taking action on your data. And I think it's really most important where you're putting in the hands of your privacy, security, and governance teams the ability to maintain the health of the data in your organization. So Jen, I'd love to get your insights. I mean, does this diagram reflect what you've seen and observed in the industry?
Well, I wish I had a different answer based on my experience, but I would say that a lot of what I see is in the cataloging space, minus the data discovery, and a little bit in the defined space. So I think there's a lot of work that people are continuing to want to do around the master data, around the data categories, and how we talk about our business glossary and create a business glossary. And then I'm really excited to get more familiar with the insights and actions pillars as we continue to lay out our data discovery program.
Great. And this is just another view of the previous slide, but this is the vision of data management reimagined at Big ID. The complexities of your data landscape is simplified by automating the data discovery for all your data sources and data types through virtual connections. And by applying Big ID's 4 C's, which is catalog, classify, correlate, and cluster, this allows for the automated insights to your data for your data teams and business users. And finally, the top layer is the actions, the applications that you can put in the fingertips of your privacy teams, security teams, and data governance teams to manage your data. And lastly, we understand that your data and technology landscape is not going to be simple. It's not going to be straightforward. There's complex business problems that need to be solved. And we have enterprise solutions that certainly fit the different models, from distributed to centralized, decentralized, and all for the purpose of monitoring and governing your data for all multiple purposes. So with that said, love to take some Q&A from the audience, and I hope everyone's enjoyed the comments today so far.
Okay, thank you, Peggy. We have a few audience questions. The first one, after creating a data inventory, do you have guidelines on publishing that inventory in a catalog accessible to data consumers? In other words, should all the data that you discover be published in a catalog?
Jen is shaking her head. So go ahead.
I have experience with that because I thought it would be a brilliant idea to have a catalog with all of our sensitive data mapped and tagged, and had not thought through the complication that now I'm embarrassed to say this was years ago, my CISO was worried about. He basically said we created a treasure map to anybody who wants to steal any of our data. So when it comes to sensitive data, I would say, no, that is probably not data that should be discovered and shared and made available in an easy way. But I haven't run into other use cases where people are concerned around different types of data.
Exactly. And you do want to put the controls in place where especially sensitive or confidential data is tagged and labeled properly and given to, like, from access governance needs to be there. So that's given to the right people and the right users, and the purpose of their usage needs to be documented. I think in theory, having very transparent data governance catalog, inventory, it helps with things like understanding data lineage and impact analysis. But I think the data governance teams needs to put some guidelines and guardrails in place.
Okay, and another question about data governance. Data governance is a cultural journey, and traditional approaches will not work. It takes smart data governance to enable data-driven value creation. Can you describe what smart data governance is? What sets it apart from the traditional approaches?
All right. Peggy, do you want me to take it, or do you want to take
You
it?
can start first. I'm trying to think what they mean by.
Well, I think it can mean a lot of different things, but I think if I take that question and say, all right, when I tried to go in to an organization and say, all right, we need all our metadata and our business glossary, and we need everything tagged, it goes nowhere and nobody's very interested. So I think some of the things that I've put in place in an organization around our consolidated data platforms, as I was saying earlier, is building the governance into the process. So while it might feel like a roadblock in the beginning, people just get used to governing data, and over time it becomes more simple. I got in a discussion a couple days ago with my leader who said I needed to catalog all of the data elements within the organization, which is very challenging, and sometimes the outcomes aren't very valuable. So a different approach we take there, saying we'll understand the data from a technical perspective, and when somebody wants to consume it or use it for a specific business case, we will start to kick off the governance process. There's also opportunities to build governance into the SDLC process that I've seen as being somewhat successful. So I'm not sure if somebody had a smarter idea of smart data governance, but those are some of the things I've used to try to make sure I'm not just governing for the sake of governing, but we're managing risk while ensuring we're adding as much value as we can to an organization.
Yeah, well said, Jennifer. And I think that what's smart for one company is going to be different for other organizations. So really being able to understand those complexities that you laid out earlier is going to be a smart, that's going to be the smartest approach.
So the next question, in your experience, is using AI, has using AI improved the ability to consolidate data from different parts of the company which have different data models?
So I'll start with this one, Jen, and you can certainly come in with your experience with using AI. So AI is very powerful, and I think that a lot of organizations are starting to, use machine learning AI to really understand things like examples that I mentioned earlier around duplications or similarities, clustering, groupings of similar data sets together. It's really powerful, especially if you're in a large organization. You don't want to continue the proliferation of data that's multiplied throughout the organization. You want to know where you can do that type of consolidation and really identify, eventually the single source of the truth, not have multiple sources necessarily. So that's where AI can certainly be leveraged. And then when it comes to consolidating different ontologies across the organization, I think that's where AI can really help data architects think about what are things that are similarly named or similarly used for the same purpose, but have a different naming convention. And we've been looking at Big ID different types of ontologies across the financial services industry. FIBO is most common one that I'm most familiar with. But what if different types of other organizations have another data model that they want to consolidate or add on to FIBO? How would they do that in automated fashion, right? They don't want to necessarily leverage an architect to manually maintain that model. So this is where I really see an opportunity for AI machine learning to really accelerate a lot of that consolidation and creation of new data ontologies for organizations and for industries.
Okay, let's end with a lightning round. 60 seconds for each of you to answer this question. Tips to boost business interest and buy-in to data governance models.
Great. Well, I'll give you my bumps and bruises tips from the last 7 months. Don't touch anybody's stuff. Make sure that all of the things that you want to do add value to the business, and try to find the use cases out there, the people who are struggling to use data, the people who are running into the biggest challenges around data, and build that use case for the organization so that you can solve for those challenges in a way that also helps you consolidate your data, organize your data, identify your data, and just add value to the organization.
And to add to that, I would say that look across your organization. What type of business processes are already being done that can be leveraged and reused? If you already have a strong privacy program that's already identifying, tagging sensitive data, why not expand on that and use that as a foundation for growing your data governance program, right? Why choose multiple vendors for different solutions when there are options out there that, where you can build a single source of truth, right? One repository where you're doing the same type of consistent data discovery, data scanning for the entire purpose, and then custom fit that for the privacy, the governance, security teams. So really look across your organization, rationalize not only your technology systems, but your business use cases and your business processes, and making sure that you're really doing things in a more holistic and smart way.
All right. Well, that ends all of the submitted questions. Peggy, 1 minute for your closing comments.
So I just want to take this last minute to thank Jennifer for being with me today on this platform and to have this discussion with us, because talking about holistic data governance is a topic that's been really close to my heart. And as a data governance practitioner, I've struggled with these issues, and I've seen companies still struggle today with these business problems. And to really have a more smarter way, I think, to approach these problems and think about, some of the fundamental issues that are still plaguing companies, especially with organizational structures and operating models. Fix those first, but at the same time, look forward, look to the future, and identify how things can be done in a better way as well. So I thank everyone for being here. If there's any questions, I know Jennifer and I are open to having more discussions with everyone offline. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, Peggy and Jen. And this concludes our session.